Let's talk about test cutting or cutting in European martial arts. So as many of you will know, in the modern practice of HEMA, historical European martial arts, many people use test cutting as we call it. That's just the term that we've kind of settled on, or doesn't specifically, you could call it whatever you like, just cutting. Many people use cutting as a form of training, and some people have debated about the validity of using cutting in the practice of European swordsmanship. They say, oh, it's borrowing from Japanese martial arts, you're using tatami mats, blah blah blah. But the fact of the matter is that, as I've mentioned in previous videos, absolutely without any doubt, cutting of mediums is part of the practice of European martial arts, at the very least. From the 19th century, when it was incredibly common. I have shown lead cutting swords. There's also a type of sword called a handkerchief cutter. In the 19th century, people practicing with sabres and cutlasses very often did what were called sword feats, and that there was many types of them. If you want to read more about them, have a look on the Schola Gladiatoria website, fioredelivery.org. On the resources section, and you'll find John Musgrave Waite's treatise on there from 1880, which incidentally is the main sabre fencing treatise that I teach from. And he has a whole section, because he was quite famous for doing these cutting feats, and he has a whole section on the different types of cutting, and the different things that you cut, and the tricks, the ways of basically getting good at cutting those things. And what things did they cut? Well, basically everything. We know that they cut different types of fruit and vegetable, everything from mangold wurzel, which is like a large turnip, I think. It's a root vegetable anyway, right the way through things like lemons, apples in handkerchiefs, all kinds of stuff, right the way up to lead bars. In Germany, I know they used to cut iron wires as a way of testing the blades. And right the way up to meat as well. Most commonly in Britain it was a sheep, a dead sheep of course, and it was strung up, and the idea was to try and sever it with one blow. And the fact is that they used different types of swords to exhibit different types of skills, and that's the important thing. It's not just saying that there's only one type of cutting which is the right type of cutting, because of course when we're cutting things, you're trying to test different skills, and you're not always cutting the same type of thing. So trying to cut through someone's arm if they're wearing a gambeson is very different to trying to cut someone's head if there's nothing on it, and equally if arm is involved, that completely changes the whole game. So the fact is that you need different types of sword, different types of edge, different types of cutting method, for different types of target and different purposes. So ultimately the sword feats were to test skill, and they were a way of training, and that is why we include it in the modern practice of HEMA, most importantly, because it improves your form. It's very easy when you're just sparring or fencing to get into the habit of hitting people with a sword, but if you look at the way that most modern Olympic sabre fencers strike with their very light sort of 500 gram sabres, more like 400 gram actually, there's no cutting method there at all, and in fact you can score with any part of the blade, I believe, with a modern sabre, with the flat or the back, not just with the cutting edge. And so it becomes hitting rather than cutting, and they're very different things, and the way you hit with a stick is quite different to how you cut with a sword. But the reason I'm talking about these things is because of this exciting new book, Cutting with the Medieval Sword, by Michael Edelson. Michael Edelson, I know him as Mike, but Mike Edelson. And you may think that name sounds familiar. It might be because you know Mike. He's quite prolific on the internet, particularly on the Facebook groups. He posts quite a lot of useful stuff. So you might know Mike Edelson, or you may remember his name from a previous interview I've done. I think I did it in 2 parts when I was in Maryland in America at Long Point in 2016. I met up with Mike. In fact, I shared a room with him. He's my roomie, yeah, I did an interview with him talking about cutting in European martial arts, and this is an exciting new book. I say it's an exciting new book, and I tell no lie, it is exciting, because as far as I'm aware, in modern times, nobody has written a book about the art of cutting things with swords in European martial arts, with European swords, but specifically with medieval swords. Now, I mentioned that most of the historical sources we've got for cutting are 19th century, and that's certainly true. That doesn't mean that they didn't cut things earlier. In fact, we do have some references to them cutting things in Europe. We certainly know it happened in other parts of the world, and people always think about Japan because that's the most exposed or most publicised version of sword cutting, but India was famous for cutting feats, and the Middle East as well. Everything from piles of clay to straw men. This was done in Russia, incidentally, as well. Straw men through to vegetables and fish. Fish were quite difficult to cut. You see, if you watch Forged in Fire, you see them cut fish sometimes. That's why, because fish scales are quite good at deflecting a good cut. But the fact is that cutting is something that you can find in traditions right the way across the world, where swordsmanship is practiced to a high degree. They introduced cutting at some point because it's a very useful form of training. And so this book, Cutting with a Medieval Sword, is about cutting, but it's more than that. It's so much more. It's a lifestyle choice. No, it's about body mechanics, actually. But so I haven't read all of it so far. I have read through some of it, and I've detailed read a few bits of it. I've only had this book myself for a couple of weeks, and it's been Christmas, so I haven't had a lot of time to read stuff. But basically it gives a lot of diagrams, photographs, and you see it's actually got illustrations in. Let's get another good page here. There we go. It's got things about line and how to stand, how your arms should be extended. You see there's more illustrations with arrows showing motion and everything. And it's more than just a book about cutting. It's a book about making you think about body mechanics, okay, and what you do, what's happening when you perform a cut. And as mentioned, many people in modern sports, such as HEMA or sport fencing or kendo or whatever, think about hitting, and it's very different if you've got a sharp weapon and you're thinking about cutting, okay? But more than that, if you are actually fencing, you want to have good form when you perform a cut for many different reasons, not just so the cut is more effective, but so it's developed, it's delivered more directly and efficiently, and you're better balanced, and more energy is transferred to the target, and these kind of things. So it's a body mechanics book with but focusing within the realm of cutting and how to make cutting more effective. Now, I will say at this point that so Mike and I have had quite a lot of back and forth about various topics over the years, but one of those is cutting. And one of the things that you will find if you read this book is I've talked a lot about perpendicular cuts versus draw cuts, and that topic is dealt with to a reasonable amount of depth actually in this book, and which I should just mention is available on Amazon right now. Obviously I'll put a link below. And I have to say, so I have a slight problem with this topic because I completely agree with Mike's logic, which you can read in this book, and Mike's logic makes sense, and Mike's argument is also backed up by evidence based on cutting tatami mats principally, but also other things, meat and other things. However, it runs slightly in contrary to what historical sources, let's say 19th century sources, say about delivering cuts. And in those cases, they generally advise to do something akin to what you might know as a draw cut, that is striking at a slight angle to the target rather than striking perpendicular to it. And for me, this is also supported in what we see in some of the medieval sources, where we see Scheitelhau, which is delivered like this, is quite a perpendicular cut, but a conventional Oberhau is developed more like this. Now, there's various reasons for that. Partly for coverage, because when you cut like this, you're covering yourself with the sword. When you do this, you're coming over a person's guard and you're not covering yourself with the sword so much underneath. If we look at Fiore de Liberi, for example, his standard fendente is with the hands lower than the point of impact or the hands higher than the point of impact. So there is always an angle on the blade. I would argue this is for other reasons as well. This is also so you can, once you've cut, the blade is free to pass through and carry on. If you strike perpendicular, it might go deeper into the target, but it's more likely to get stuck or stop until your weapon's not free. Anyway, that's a whole nother topic, and I could make several videos just about that. But just to say, I'm not just saying like purely like, this isn't just advertising blurb just for Mike's book, although I would say buy it if you're interested in cutting and swords and any martial arts, not just European. But there are some things in there that made me go, is that right? And that's the point. This book makes you think, and as well as, you know, if you're a novice coming to it, it will teach you a lot, okay? If you're a beginner in any form of blade-based martial arts, could be Kali, could be Kinjitsu, could be HEMA, whatever, then this is useful, both from a cutting perspective and from a body mechanics perspective. But if you're an experienced practitioner, which I'm reluctant to describe, I suppose I'm in relative terms, I'm an experienced practitioner in HEMA terms, it made me think about some things, because for many, many years I've been telling my students and telling my viewers and telling myself that a certain way of cutting is done for a certain range of reasons, and Mike's explanations kind of run slightly contrary to that. And so that's just one example I fixed on. There are other examples in here where it's made me look at what I explain and how I explain it and what I believe, and question it. And that's a really, really good thing, okay? So, and this book is really, it's not preachy. It doesn't tell you this is right, this is wrong. It basically sets out his reasons for doing a thing a certain way, and then you can do with that whatever you like. I mean, so essentially this book has made me think, and I'm going to be going over it in a much more detailed way. And it's entirely possible, in fact I would say highly likely, that this book will feature in future videos of mine where I'll be talking about specific things in this book. But for this I just wanted to tell you, go and buy this book from Amazon, because frankly there aren't a huge number of books out there available for blade-based martial arts that are actually any good, and this is one of them. Okay, so I'm going to wrap it up there, but really just to say, this book is not only about cutting, it's also about body mechanics, but also it's just about the whole theory of bladed weapons, regardless of whether it's European, Asian, African, anything. And it will make you think and question what you currently believe and how you currently practice. And it may make you change a few things, it might not, it might reinforce what you believe, but it will definitely make you think. And there is a lot of very, very deep and detailed knowledge in this book that I frankly have not seen anything like in any other book. So there we go. It is Cutting with the Medieval Sword by Michael Edelson. And if you're interested in training with Mike, incidentally, he's based, well, he actually doesn't live in New York, but his club is mostly based in New York and around that area of the East Coast. So go and visit them. I'll put a link to their club below as well. So below this video, link to this book on Amazon, and a link to Mike's own group. And yeah, I hope you get it and I hope you enjoy it, because if you're going to spend a bit of money on, I can't remember how much this was actually on Amazon, I think it's about £29–30 in the UK, and I don't know what it is in the US, but if you're going to spend that kind of money on a book, this is a very, very good one to get, okay? And it applies to all bladed arts, not just European, not just medieval. Okay, I hope that's been interesting and useful, and I'll see you on my next video. Cheers guys! Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. We have extra videos on Patreon, and you can follow us on Facebook.